Okay, so we are continuing our discussion of Descartes, and we just talked a little bit about his influence, the way in which his way of thinking, if not caused at all, because we are really nowadays very unclear about the notion of causality. We are really sort of tracing and tracking correlation, and it's really not possible to say that something that correlates with something else really caused it. We'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the discussion of cause and effect, etc. But for now, I'm reading Descartes as an example of modern way of thinking. Now, Descartes in philosophy is considered to be the father of modern philosophy. This is an accepted general proposition. Now, that doesn't mean everybody read Descartes and everybody sort of responded to Descartes or took his ideas and accepted them. It just means that he reflects the time, the spirit of time really well. So that's really the claim here. When I say modern philosophy, it starts with Descartes, that means a lot of problems that modern philosophers subsequently deal with come from Descartes. Now, it also his influence of science. He is a philosopher, and obviously up until 19th century, there were really no, strictly speaking, independent disciplinary scientific activities. They were all considered to be philosophy of something. So like physics, chemistry, biology, etc. were called either philosophy of life or philosophy of nature. There was no sort of, there was a name, but there was no organizational sort of structure like psychology and sociology, etc. These are all sort of modern university. They would study philosophy and theology. They would study the topics, but they were all studying that under the heading of philosophy, as I mentioned before, I'm sure. And when you get your doctorate degree, you in chemistry or in any other field, you are still a doctor of philosophy. So you are always called PhD is philosophy doctorate. PhD is always a philosophy degree, although they never study philosophy, but nevertheless, it is named as such. So when we read Descartes, therefore, I'm making frequent references the way in which we understand science today. And one of the things that is philosophically very important is a very stark contrast with Plato is his emphasis on figuring out truth by himself. He gives this extended metaphor on architect. He is building something and he keeps saying that one architect is better than many architects. I'm building it for myself. I'm thinking it for myself. I'm not accepting anybody else's authority. I'm not negotiating or dialogue with anybody else. I am thinking for myself, and there are many indications for that, starting with this really strong claim that this is on page 5, the very bottom. This is why, as soon as age permitted me to emerge from the supervision of my teachers. So he is no longer accepting his teacher. I completely abandoned the study of letters. That means like study of various disciplines, and resolving to search for no knowledge other than what could be found within myself. And I think that's really important, starting this idea of thinking for yourself, being able to reason for yourself. And it's a complicated claim because it might give you the impression that Descartes is against like education, against disciplines, against school, etc. To a certain extent, that might be true, but he studied all of those. He studied all of those and came to the conclusion that they don't give anything clear and distinct. That's really an expression that he uses many times, most explicitly on page 11, the first time, when he says, never accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. That seems to be his first principle that he comes up with on part 2. But before we continue with that, let's just reflect on that for a second, because it is, as a principle, seems to be a pretty convincing principle. Don't accept anything as true which is not clear and distinct. Clear and distinct means it's obvious, and distinct, namely, it is not mixed up with anything else. It is just a reflection on that particular proposition. Now, you might accept this as a principle. The difficulty starts, and as it will start, and Riley indicated that a little bit last time, what he considers to be clear and distinct. Now, you might disagree with what he considers to be clear and distinct. This is different than the principle that you accept as, yes, we should accept true as true only that is clear and distinct, but that what you are saying is not clear and distinct. So if you bring a criticism, you need to bring the criticism to his method rather than to the content of his method. So if it is one thing to say, look, Descartes, what you are saying there is not clear and distinct. It's another thing to say, no, you should not consider clear and distinct proposition as true. Do you see this difference? Any confusion here? Everybody is clear? Okay, so the idea again is, he says, for example, I have a clear and distinct idea of God in my mind. He will say that later, as you already read. You might say, no, you do not have a clear and distinct idea of God. What you consider to be clear and distinct is not that clear and distinct. That's one thing to say. And it would probably, depending on the person, that might be a valid argument. But I mean, if it's a valid argument, it's valid for everybody. But like, it might be a valid argument, let's just say. But you might say, you know, you should not look for truth in ideas that are clear and distinct. That's not a good idea. In fact, you should only look for truth in what you perceive, in your perception, what you see, what you hear. It might not be clear and distinct, but you should accept that as truth. And certain tradition, who is considered to be an empiricist, as opposed to Descartes, who is a rationalist, might say that, might say, no, we should not look into our minds because our minds are always like feeble, bad, not successful. We should look into the world. What you think, what you come up with your own thinking as clear and distinct, doesn't mean anything. You are empty. You are a tabula rasa, as John Locke, a British empiricist, says. You should just accept truth as ideas that come to you from your senses, from your perception. What you see, what you hear, what you touch, that must be the beginning of knowledge. So here, Descartes doesn't say that. Descartes says the opposite, what I find in myself as clear and distinct. And one of the implications of this is obviously that, as you have already seen, and as you read it, that he is not going to accept the perception, the knowledge that comes from the senses, as reliable at all. He says, senses deceive us, so I'm not going to accept that. So I have to find something that is completely cut off from the senses. Now we'll come back to that more explicitly in our discussion of meditations, the first meditation, when he challenges the truth of ideas that come from the senses. But I want to say a few more things about this beginning of the discourse and some of the claims that he makes. First, he says, I have these ideas that I learned from reading, from my study, etc. And the reason that I doubt them and I don't accept them is not because they're all wrong. And that's one of the things, like, oh, education is useless and you should never read a book, you should not learn another language, etc. He's not saying a simple statement like that. He's saying there is nothing certain, solid, firm in those ideas. So you study philosophy, they disagree with each other. You study other sciences, there might not be consensus about this or that. There is always a possibility of something being different. And that is really generally a philosophical problem, something that contemporary science really doesn't take into consideration very well. All the knowledge that we have with respect to the external world that comes from empirical meaning through the senses, through perception, through observation, might be different, might change. Now, even though we come up with like laws of nature, whenever we say, empirical laws of nature, in the sense that, what is the, what is the velocity of gravity in vacuum? I used to know that. Anybody studying physics?
Negative 9.8 meters per second.
Why negative? Like going down, that's why?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
The acceleration, not the velocity, it's the acceleration due to gravity.
Acceleration, yes. So it accelerates with 9.81 meter per
second.
Second square. Second square.
Correct. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, see, so now this is a law, right? Now does this have something to do with the particular empirical configuration of the Earth? Material of the Earth. Well, is it the same everywhere?
No, it's just Earth. That's just Earth.
What's that?
I mean, like on Earth, there are some variations, but because those variations are quite small, like sometimes could be 0.00001 for some places, because I don't know, the Earth is squared. So the common sense would be just go with 9.81, and if you want like an even number, just go with 10.
Is it the same on the sun?
No.
Is it the same on the moon?
No.
Okay, so we came up with 981. It's a pretty reliable knowledge. We love it. It has been with us for, let's say, hundreds of years. And then, all of a sudden, as a result of various misfortunes that the Earth experienced this year, and, not to mention hurricanes, etc., there was a possibility of something hitting the Earth on last year in April. It didn't, unfortunately, but it could have. So let's just say we exploded. And like the Earth sort of was hit by a gigantic meteor and it just exploded. So that's a very distinct possibility, even though we hopefully won't experience it in our lifetime. So that kind of knowledge, not just we are false with respect to what we claim to be, but what we know might change too. And that's really the sort of nature of empirical knowledge. Therefore, scientists say two things. First, we might be completely wrong as a skeptical. We might be completely wrong about our knowledge or so-called knowledge about the empirical knowledge. But also we might be wrong that what we know might change. So for example, what climate scientists today measure and try to understand is distinctly different from what they thought about if they existed 400 years ago. Because the Earth has changed. Our knowledge of it has to change as well, because the object of what we claim to know changes. And in fact, science makes that happen, in the sense that since we can know something so well, we can actually change it. And that's really our kind of motivation behind climate change, that we can change it back or make it different or something like that. So whatever we measure about the earth today, hopefully is going to be different 50 years from now, because that's what we actually are aiming at. So that's the empirical knowledge that might change, and that is really not firm for Descartes. So what he is looking for is something that is going to be clear and distinct and solid and firm. And the metaphor firm, solid, is important because he uses the extended metaphor of architecture. I am building a house. I am building an edifice. I'm building sciences, a house of knowledge, if you like. But what should be the foundation of that? What is it that we are basing all our knowledge on? Now, this is important because with Descartes, well, let's just leave there. What is it going to be with Descartes? What is going to be the foundation? What is the first certainty?
I think, therefore I am.
That's the statement. What in that statement is the foundation?
The
Thanks.
capacity for thought.
Capacity for thought. And also the first thing that he comes up with, I think, therefore, as a thinking thing, I must exist. I think, therefore I am, means I exist only to the extent that I think. So the interesting point is that we are trying to establish something firm, solid foundation of sciences, but it is based on my ability to think. I, cogito, I think, cogito is the Latin, I think, becomes the foundation of all this. So human thinking, in fact, the ability to think becomes the foundation of all scientific activity subsequently. And we don't observe this in sciences today because we think that I is simply subjective. And we always think that, oh, we always think different things. We would never agree. Therefore, you cannot really decide something on the basis of human thinking. You need to decide it on method or on scientific research methods, etc. Now, while that is true that individually we might have different opinions, it doesn't change the fact that science itself is based on human thinking. And with Descartes, that which appears to be most different, most unique, most what belongs only to you, namely I. When you say I, you are under this impression that you are indicating something very particular, very unique to you. But what you are actually articulating is the most universal truth. Everybody and anybody can occupy that space of the I. And scientific activity, our knowledge is really based on that notion. Now, this is a difficult thought to comprehend because we culturally and historically so determined to think the I as very different from each other. My I am very different than you. Now, first, everybody thinks that somehow, so that makes it a little bit of universal too. But that I is a simple placeholder. It's a shifter because everybody can occupy that position. And it is perhaps the most universal thing for human beings. We all have the ability to occupy that rational space of I. We can all think. And to the extent that we can think, we are all the same. That's why science wants us to put all the unique things about I to the side, but think about from the space of the universal. How can you not accept something that is rationally presented to you? And the fact that a lot of people might not accept what is rationally demonstrated, proved to you, doesn't mean they don't have the capacity to occupy that position. So with Descartes, we are starting with this understanding of what in philosophy is called subjectivity. But one of the misunderstandings of people who don't understand philosophy or don't read philosophy is they think that subjectivity is actually opposed to objectivity. When we say, oh, that's just a simple subjective opinion, that's just your opinion, objectively it is different. But whatever considered to be objective is really that which is posed or put against a subject. And that subject has no other characteristics than just being a thinking thing. So in a sense, the reason why science is claiming to be objective is it's because it's utterly subjective, where the subject is a universal I. Okay, that's a fairly complicated philosophical argument. Can you wrap your mind around it? Is it clear? Geneva, your facial expression says, I'm not sure. Some of you can do it really well. You look like, yeah, I got this. The others express skepticism in your faces. Any questions?
So like subjectivity is like the universal I. So
Yeah.
like, what was this objectivity again?
Objectivity is to be able to see the world, as scientists say, in terms of a universal knowledge that is relatively firm. Although objective knowledge is always questionable because objects change around us from perception. But whenever they tell us, you need to accept the findings of scientific truth. Why? Why do they say that? Why do they say like scientific? Oh yeah, science, we have to accept that. Sure, that sounds reasonable. Why?
Because there's proof.
So
Often.
proof, yeah, proof. Like, what if I say like that proof is for you, not for me? You might accept that as proof. I don't. Like, you know, okay, so I'm not recording this part. Okay, I can continue. So when we say proof, we are really relying on a particular way of thinking that you should be able to clear and distinctly, and it is complicated. It's not always as easy as it sounds. Therefore, you are being educated in the sciences for years, trying to understand scientific methods, blah, blah. But that's really something that starts as a problem, as an issue with Descartes. So, but one thing that just sort of shift gears a little bit, what I want to emphasize a lot is this emphasis of individual exploration of philosophy. Now with Plato, we saw the dialogue being the main medium of philosophical reflection. Socrates always questioned people and philosophized, so to speak, in relation to someone else. For Descartes, starting with this extended metaphor on architecture, he says, just me. I will do this myself. And, you know, when you look at the cities, if it is done by one architect, it's much better than various other architects. It's much orderly, much less messy. It is better. For example, it also gives like another example or another metaphor like Sparta, the ancient city. The laws were not particularly good, but they were made by one person. Therefore, it worked. So in a sense, there is a kind of non-democratic, individual-based understanding of philosophy that you are now thinking for yourself. Now, thinking for yourself and emphasizing this, it's great for sort of advertising of education, for example, or liberal arts. Like we say that we teach you how to think for yourself. You need to be able to be educated and you will be independent from others, etc., which appears to be like great. I mean, everybody for some reason wants to think for themselves. But we don't want everybody to come to different conclusions because there is really no possibility of having any kind of common discourse if somebody walks into the House of Representatives and shows a snowball and say, this is my proof that there is no global warming, then we really don't have a common discourse. So what Descartes is doing is very complicated, because he doesn't just pay lip service to individualistic thinking. He is also showing that, ironically, or not paradoxically, but I mean, it's beautifully actually, which we call dialectic, which will come later, that which appears to be the most unique, most different, most you, is actually the most universal. I actually is the foundation of all thinking that seems to be valid for everyone. So it is, I mean, he starts out with that too, like he says, I'm just representing my life as a picture in front of you. This is just for me. I'm not suggesting this to be for anybody else. This is just how I did it. This is my method, etc. But then when you read it, you notice that this must be valid for everybody. It can't be just for Descartes. And that's the most powerful element of his thinking, is because you can say I, you are an I, you are a cogito. He doesn't say that Descartes, me, I exist. He says the I exist, and that's valid for everybody. So whenever people actually talk about, like, oh, this is just me, there's sort of an inescapable universal dimension. And in fact, if you capture, in an ironic way, the most individual and unique to you, you are actually capturing something that is most universal. Because we are all rational beings, because we all have common sense, and that is valid for everybody. So you might notice that when you hear people saying things like, oh, this is just me, then you say, that maybe it's not just you. Maybe there's a lot of other people who would agree with that. Oh, this is just my truth. Well, you might want to appropriate it. You might want to say it is just you, because you might not want to be challenged, and people saying, no, that's not true. And you say, no, this is just my truth, or something like that. But you also notice that, no, that doesn't just belong to you. If it is a valid point, it must be valid for everybody. So Descartes sort of pushes us to question a lot of assumptions that we make with respect to individualistic thinking in the 21st century. So we'll question that throughout the book. Actually, when we move to Kant, we will do that too. So now, there is a contrasting attitude. So with respect to theoretical knowledge, with respect to what he knows theoretically, scientifically, he is saying, I'm never going to trust something that is not solid and firm. And I'm going to be skeptical of most things, everything with respect to theoretical knowledge. But he also says that, okay, so I'm building a house. So I'm building a new house. I tear down everything, which we will more explicitly discuss in meditation. So I'll tear down everything, but I need a place to live. And that is really his so-called practical life, how he's going to continue to engage in his philosophical and theoretical activities while he is living in another house. So he says on page 13, and finally, just as it is not enough, before beginning to rebuild the house. So it's again this metaphor of architect rebuilding the house where one is living, simply pull it down, and to make provision for materials and architects, or train oneself in architecture, and also to have carefully drawn up the building plans for it. But it is also necessary to be provided with someplace else where one can live comfortably while working on it. So this is sort of his if I'm engaged in this activity of questioning all my education and all my knowledge, I should continue to live. And I should continue to live comfortably somewhere else. So in order not to remain irresolute in my actions while reason required me to be so in my judgments, and in order not to cease to live as happily as possible during this time. So you can engage in this theoretical skepticism and be skeptical or suspicious of all your beliefs. But with respect to other things in life, you need to continue to live comfortably. I formulated a provisional code of morals. That's what, morals, which consisted of about 3 or 4 maxims, which I very much want to share with you. We are not really going to discuss these in detail, but first, to obey the laws and the customs of my country, constantly holding on to the religion in which, by God's grace, I have been instructed from my childhood, and governing myself in everything else according to the most moderate opinions, and those furthest from excess, opinions that were commonly accepted in practice by the most judicious of those with whom I would have to live. So with respect to morality and laws and customs, is that I'm continuing with. Now, this separation is really important because one of the things that today people wonder or marvel is like you observe certain theoretical minds, scientists, etc. They are investigating really amazing, intriguing theoretical questions. And when you sort of question them in everything else, they seem to be pretty ordinary. And they seem to accept most basic prejudices. Like, you are a scientist, how can you be a racist? It's like, yeah, that's very possible. In fact, scientists really separate that activity from the morals, etc. So, hey, in order to live comfortably in my country, I'm going to be sexist and racist or blah, blah, whatever, because I'm just doing my scientific activities. So with Descartes, this possibility of splitting human life into distinct domains and play different roles in different aspects of life becomes possible. So, and that is really not Descartes is doing that. That is really a very interesting phenomenon of modern life. You have different roles, different functions in different areas of life. And you should be able to live them without them contradicting each other or making each other difficult. Therefore, this kind of, when we talk about the disintegration of the self, the kind of alienation in modernity, we are really talking about this phenomenon that you have to fulfill different functions and play different roles in different aspects of life. You don't have a, like we talk a lot about integrity in Quaker discourse, but it's really not possible. It's really not possible to have integrity the way in which life became so complicated, so differentiated that you have to play different roles in different aspects of your life. And we criticize each other for that, mercilessly, actually. It's like, how can you be so inconsistent while you say this in your life and you do this in your other aspect of your life? And that is really not, I mean, we should not really blame each other. We should not blame individuals. We should really try to understand how the world became as such that we have different functions and you don't even think about it. Like, I'm not an individual. I am a teacher. I am a father. I am a worker. I am a friend. And all those require different kind of approaches. And that becomes possible. Like, you are not a wholesome individual. You don't have integrity. The world is so complicated that your integrity would be impossible. In fact, I mean, you can't really get away with it. Like, you can't be a teacher the way in which you are a friend. I would be fired in 5 minutes. You can't be an employee the way you are a sister or a brother. You would be fired in 2 seconds. So, I mean, you really have to play different roles, like in different parts of the world. And that becomes possible, and Descartes recognizes that and says like, look, I'm engaged in this theoretical activity. I'm just going to be fairly conservative, and in fact, fairly dogmatic. On page 14, he says, my second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and to follow the most doubtful opinions once I had decided on them with no less constancy than if they had been very well assured. This is almost exactly the opposite of what he is doing in the sciences, in thinking for knowledge. This is on page 14, the first full paragraph. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and to follow the most doubtful opinion. In fact, in theoretical thinking, he says, I should never accept, even there is the slightest doubt. Here he says, I should follow the most doubtful. So this is the kind of this complete contrast between theoretical life and practical life. Theoretical inquiry and practical. Therefore, you know, when people say, oh, there are some scientists, they also believe in God, obviously. It's like, sure, because one has nothing to do with each other. They don't answer the same question. One is about them wanting to have friends on Sunday and have a community and hang out with their neighbors. Therefore, they go to church and therefore they have faith. But during the week, they are working. They are in their jobs. They are performing a different kind of function. Then I can have this scientific method in my mind. I can be like very skeptical of everything. I can be always look for evidence, but then I'm not engaged in the same activity when I go to church and or wherever that I investigate. I don't investigate anything. So he says, I'm like someone who lost in the forest. So he gives this, I mean, he has really great metaphors. I like the way in which he uses these analogies and metaphors like architect and the building, and then this someone who is like lost in the field, lost in forest. He says, just go in one direction, just go on a straight line. You are likely to get out of it, rather than trying to figure out the correct path, which would be the correct method. Just keep walking. It might be a completely wrong path, but at least it will get you just from the middle of the forest. You'll at least hit something. And it works perfectly with the idea of method, because, you know, method is like being on the correct path in theoretical knowledge. But in the practical, it doesn't have to be correct. It doesn't even matter. It just keeps you moving. And also, like, whenever we don't understand the role of certain things that we do in society, and we try to kind of question them from a scientific perspective, sort of like functionalist, structuralist, etc., and say, what purpose do they serve? Nothing. They are not invented to serve a purpose. They just keep us moving. And they may be completely wrong. It might be mistaken. It might be just a very stupid tradition. It might be a complete useless ritual, which I think most rituals are. But people are not engaging in them because they are true or valuable or good. They are engaging in them in order to keep moving. And that's something to think about once we sort of criticize certain aspect of our society, which is completely valid criticisms, but more and more it appears to me in society we tell each other that we are living wrong. Our lives are wrong. We are not living properly, truly, correctly. We are not organizing our lives according to true propositions. And I think that's a particular pressure in Western countries, the United States and other West European countries, where they give you the impression as if you figured out the right way to live. And these are the things that you should believe in. These are the things you should do. These are the things that you should never do. These are the things you should think. And these are the things you should never think. But human life is unfortunately very complicated, much more complicated than theoretical reflection, in which he says we are just trying to get out of the forest. We are just trying to move forward. We obviously don't know that our path is, whether our path is correct or not, but it sort of keeps us moving. One of the things, like, for example, there's a criticism of nationalism, patriotism, that you are too like patriotic with respect to your own nation, you need to be more cosmopolitan, etc. And it's true. I mean, if you think of it logically, from a scientific perspective, it's just a pure accident that you are born where you are born. You have no reason to be particularly attached to the, place that you were born. You don't have for some reason, as you should, like particular emotional attachment to the hospital or to the place that you were born. It's like you don't even like care about them, but that's probably more important for you. Like they made you to come, be born and like be healthy, and the nurses who cared for you, etc. You should really love them. But then you love like somebody who was born in Alaska or Louisiana because they happen to be American, or wherever you are born from your country. It makes no sense. It like logically it makes no sense, but it is a kind of common path that people sort of have, like, in order to make connections to other people, and then you invent these allegiances, blah, blah. You cannot evaluate that according to its logical form. I mean, you should, and you do whatever you want, but you cannot really criticize people on the basis of their lack of knowledge in this, because this is not a theoretical, but it's a purely practical activity.
Yeah, George. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, the way you were talking really reminded me of this great George Carlin bit where he says something along the lines of like, pride shouldn't be. He says like pride should be reserved for something that you achieve or obtain on your own. So he's like I never understood like any kind of like ethnic pride or like religious pride. He was like, being Irish isn't a skill. He's like, it's a genetic accident. He's like, I think he says like, I wouldn't say that I'm proud to be 5'10", or that I'm proud to have a predisposition for colon cancer.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think he has a point.
I think actually I would be more proud of having a predisposition for colon cancer than being, because being Turkish is not even genetic. It is really like my DNA, mostly like sort of things that are stuck in my tooth and blah, blah, turn out to be in common with people who lived in the same area. And therefore I am considered to be Turkish, because my genes don't come with Turkish flag and says like, oh, you are Turkish or something like that. So, I mean, even if you think of it sort of materially, it is not symbolic at all. But colon cancer, yeah, that's more like, I mean, I would not be proud, but I would be more concerned about it. You're right. I mean, that's really, therefore we cannot really evaluate it according to the rational principles of theoretical knowledge. I mean, maybe you should, and you are more than welcome to if you do, but we really cannot understand them properly if we do, because it really doesn't make sense. So like, for example, Descartes initiates a kind of split individuality, a kind of individuals who have different parts of their lives, parts of their roles, and living and being differently. Okay, I guess I'm getting a little tired. So let's take a little break so that I can breathe, and then maybe we start, let's just say around 9:10 or so, like 10-minute break, so that we can end maybe around 10. Okay? All right. I just want to go over a couple of principles that we touched upon. These are the practical principles that he talks about on page 13 and 14. The third one that we mentioned the first two. We talked about obey the laws and customs of my country, and then be resolute and firm, even following doubtful opinions about practical affairs. And the third one is important because well, they're all important, but third one is important because it really gives us an interesting principle of life that Descartes really learned from previous philosophers, um, especially Stoics. He says, my third maxim, this is the page 14 bottom, was always to try to conquer myself rather than fortune, and to change my desires rather than the order of the world, and generally to accustom myself to believing that there is nothing that is completely within our power except our thoughts, so that after we have done our best regarding things external to us, everything that is lacking for us to succeed is, from our point of view, absolutely impossible. And this alone seems to be sufficient to prevent me in the future from desiring anything but what I was to acquire, and thus make me contented. So this is really a principle of life, in the sense that being able to conquer yourself rather than fortune, this is as a way of living, as a principle that in order to be able to survive in this world, you really need to conquer your desires. Somehow, as long as you live in order to satisfy your desires, you are always going to be at the mercy of fortune. And fortune, like luck and whether you have circumstances, that's something that we don't really understand very well. We always tell people, you can do whatever you want. It's sort of like a Nike commercial, just do it. And like, you know, if you are sort of, if you have these life coach type of people who pump you up and give you hope and give you like sort of perspective, it's like, if you try hard, you can do it. You can be whatever you want. They all appear to be a sort of heroic, wonderful statements in the context of individualistic, capitalistic society. But in fact, they are fairly dangerous and fairly harmful statements, because obviously, well, I'm not saying you are, but a majority of people are going to fail. The majority of people are not going to do whatever they want, because it is not only up to them, but up to the circumstances under which they were born. So, but what happens is that if you believe that you can do whatever you want, the other side of it is, if you can't, it's your fault. So you didn't try harder. You just, didn't, apply yourself as much, etc. So that's a really important sort of contradiction, because when people say, us things that are ostensibly positive, they're actually pumping negativity into our lives. So like, if somebody says to you, you can be whatever you want, like, no, you can't be whatever you want. Just want proper things. Don't want like things that you cannot. Like, you know, if somebody says, oh, you can be the president of the United States. No, you can't. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, not because that discourages you and sort of like belittles you, etc., but really trying to understand your situation. You really need to be measured in your approach to this, in the sense that you can, yes, you can maybe have a decent life and be relatively successful and die, etc. But this kind of idea that you can dream anything and you can accomplish it, and you give the example of 5-10 people who did that, as opposed to millions and millions of people who never really had a chance. And in fact, if you look at yourself now, you are pretty good. You don't have to like accomplish millions of other things in order to justify your existence. Just be thankful that you have what you have and you got what you got. So that's sort of conquering yourself and your desires, rather than living under this capitalist system under constant dissatisfaction. There's always something missing. Like, there's always something that you need to accomplish. There's something that you are not worthy as who you are. You need to do something. And that becomes your self-perception too. In one way, you become like, oh, I haven't done anything. Like, you're here, you are living, you are making certain people happy, you are not hungry, hopefully, and that's good. That's life. And compared to millions and billions of other people, you are doing okay. So be thankful. Don't live under this constant dissatisfaction. But then people are extremely unhappy because they cannot get the next phone. They are extremely unhappy because their cars don't drive 180 miles per hour. So there's always this dissatisfaction, try to conquer fortune rather than to understand yourself and conquer yourself. So I like this principle of Descartes, even though it doesn't appear to be very Nike commercial-like, in the sense that just do it because everybody can do it. Just like, you know, you look at Michael Jordan, like, I can jump as much as that. If I can't jump, that must be my fault. Or maybe my shoes are bad, so I should get better shoes. Then I can jump and be great, etc. No, and in fact, there are many things that we already accept this implicitly. I mean, I know I'm not going to want to be an astronaut. I know I'm not going to be a basketball player. I don't even aspire to that. And there are certain things that you really need to work from within with respect to your own self and desires, rather than say, oh, I'm so unfortunate. Like, you know, again, like I mean, this doesn't work with my daughter, obviously, but I try to sort of like, when she says like, oh, I need this and I want to do that, etc. And I was like, I mean, one of the things that we talk about, like, you are relatively privileged. You are not hungry. You have a place to stay. You know, you don't need to work. If you you have parents who can take care of you. That's already puts you, in terms of your fortune, ahead of billions of people. So if you recognize that, you will not be dissatisfied with your life. You will not be constantly unhappy and desire certain things, etc., but really have a perspective. And that's one of the best principles that Descartes says, like, don't go looking for things that are beyond your power, because that's going to make you unhappy. And there are a lot of people today who have like good businesses who are like depressed because they are not like Bill Gates or something. And that's a really terrible way of living, that you are never enough as an individual and you are never, you will never be satisfied. So, but I admit that long exercise is needed, as well as frequently repeated meditation, in order to become accustomed to looking everything from this point of view. And I believe that is principally in this that the secret of those philosophers consists who in earlier times were able to free themselves from fortune's domination, and who, despite sorrows and poverty, could rival their gods in happiness. And that's a really sort of Socratic moment in which philosophers are the happiest. And I mean, probably today, how would you call, what would you call them today? I have a sneaking suspicion that they would be called like losers, because they didn't get the shiny car, the sort of millions of dollars, etc. They were not like successful in that sense, because they conquered themselves, not fortune, and say, or lack of aspirations. That's what we would tell them today. It's like, oh, you are not motivated enough, or something like that, which is a very interesting phenomenon that I sort of think always, like in the 21st century, philosophers are like losers more than anything else. People would consider them losers. I think, what did you do? How much money do you have? What's your car? You have like, you are driving a bad car. I mean, you can't be possibly happy because your car sucks and you don't have a beautiful house. And, that's how we would, I mean, I'm not saying everybody, but that would be the predominant evaluation of them. And we do that. We encourage that. I mean, all the people that you love, all the people that you value, all the people that you look up to, all the people that you consider to be role models are those people. You implicitly value materialistic gain and advantage more than anything else. You value skill, sure, I mean, I hope. You value like good music and people who are skillful, capable of playing the violin or playing basketball or whatever, but you evaluate them in terms of their monetary success and fame. And that's really what we implicitly approve without really even thinking about it. Like people say like, oh, I love Michael. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm old. I only give the example of Michael Jordan, but you probably know who he is still. Pretty soon that will be old and the students won't understand. But someone like, I love Michael Jordan. It's like, why? Like, I don't even know Michael Jordan. I have never even spoken to him ever once. And I listened to staged interviews in which he presented an image to me, but he's successful and he's awesome and he's one. Or I like, yeah, Michael Jordan is probably more justified. Like someone like, what's his face, the Apple guy who died?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, exactly. I love Steve Jobs. Like, oh, he's so wonderful. It's like, who is Steve Jobs? I don't even know. I haven't talked to the guy once. I don't know whether he reads Plato. I don't know whether he can understand any book that he read. I don't know what kind of a person he is. I don't know whether he's ethical, moral. He's just successful and he has money and he invented mouse, an iPhone. Oh, that's why I love. Yeah, I mean, that's all I'm saying is that we actually value implicitly all the things that we criticize, all the things that makes this world a horrible place. We value those. And we are responsible, like not you individually, but we as responsible for our own unhappiness, because we constantly fail in our desires to fulfill that. And Descartes says you cannot conquer fortune. There are certain elements in life that you cannot control. You could have been born to a millionaire and despite having no qualifications to be a president, you could become the president of the United States. That's not an accomplishment. That's fortune. I mean, that's our misfortune, but fortune. So, but we do not need to value power and fortune and the money and the success, but we need to concentrate on ourselves. Okay, so I like that a lot. So nothing was in their power but their thoughts. So things that I cannot control, I don't control. Like, things, if my happiness is contingent upon other people and success and money and people buying my products or something like that, I cannot be happy. I'm always going to be dissatisfied at some level. So these are the practical principles, which I like very much this one. But with respect to theoretical, and then we are going to move to meditation, on page 11, he says explicitly, with respect to theoretical attitude, the first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. So theoretically, I'm going to accept only that which is beyond doubt, which is indubitable, that which cannot be doubted. In practical, I accept even the most doubtful. But in theoretical, almost exactly the opposite. I will never accept anything that is not beyond doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible and was required in order to better to resolve them. No, the second, to divide each I would examine into as many parts as possible and as was required in order to better to resolve them. So this is the analytic method. Like if you have a problem, you split it into parts and try to solve different parts and then bring it together. The third, I mean, he's really talking about a sort of rudimentary scientific method. Like if you sort of reflect back from all the research methods that you learned, this is the philosophical foundation of all those research methods, both in terms of experimentation and production of knowledge, but also in terms of teaching. I mean, when you teach, you start out with the basic elements. You do not start with like the highest level of organic chemistry. You start with elements and try to describe them, etc., and then build upon that and try to get to the more complicated composite things. So that's the third. To conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order among those things that do not naturally precede one another. And you observe this in different scientific activities. So if you want to study the structure of fields, what do you need to know first? If you want to study like string theory or physics, like what do you need to know? What do you study? What do you study in this school? Any
laws or like rules?
Yeah, you would study the laws of physics, etc. But first of all, you need to study math. Like you need to be able to calculate if you want to understand anything. The chemistry teacher, in order to understand the atomic weight of any element, don't stop and tell you, by the way, when you are making addition, 78 plus 13 is actually 91. Do you know that? No, you already know that. That's the simplest element that allows you to be able to, not even without thinking, be able to understand the composite things. So then you go back from the difficult things and say, what is the composite elements? I mean, what are the simplest elements of this that I know that I can actually make a conclusion for the more complex one. And the last, everywhere to make enumeration so complete and review so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing. So it's precision, it is certainty, and it is completeness that you cover every single detail. And that's really the beginning of a method. And the idea is whatever the content is, whatever the subject matter is, when you approach your question, your problems with these fundamental elements, then you are more likely to come up with a correct answer. So therefore, whenever you are sort of answering a question, it would be really good to first determine that you understand the question. It's good to know what the elements of that question is and what presupposition that question makes with respect to the circumstances under which it is posed. So like, you know, you have all these like set of problems, like how long does it take to fill out a pool if you are dumping this much water and you are taking this much water per second, blah, blah. You have all these like math type of questions, which presupposes that you know what a pool is, you know what water is, and that you know how to calculate because you know math, that 2 plus 2 is 4, 5 plus 5 is 10, that you can make all these simple elements in order to come up with a more complex answer. So in part, okay, any questions? Any comments? Are you following? Having difficulty? You know, you are not talking. At least you can give me like Sam a thumbs up. That makes my, yes, you can do it like virtually or in terms of your picture. I like that. Yeah, and 2 even, that's great. So, I mean, what else are these in these reactions? There's clap and there's thumbs up. Is that it? Is that all the like emojis on like Zoom? It's a very serious environment. Zoom is mostly academic. They don't want you to make like silly things. Okay. Now on part 4, he describes in a way that what he did in meditation. So these 2 texts are actually talking to each other. So whatever you read in part 4, so he's looking for something, he uses that expression indubitable on page 33. No, what 33? 18, I'm sorry. On page 18, part 4. And then he says, I do not trust anything that comes to me from my senses, because senses sometimes deceive us. Now, this argument is a little complicated, and then he'll kind of come to, I think, therefore I am. Let's therefore jump to page 59. Meditation 1, concerning those things that can be called into doubt. Now, one of the things that I want to share with you so that you don't get confused while reading is sometimes Descartes seems to be talking with 2 contradictory, if not contradictory, at least contesting voices. So first he says, my method is to call into doubt everything that came from the senses. But then there seems to be another voice, I mean, another of Descartes' voice. He says, like, how can I doubt that? So he's sort of, in a curious way, he's in a dialogue with himself. First he says, I need to doubt everything, but then in order to strengthen his argument and his method, he contests that, and he says, well, I cannot doubt that. But then he answers that. So I'll try to indicate those points in the text so that you know that there is a turn or a twist in that in that particular place where he is questioning himself with the voice of some other, idea. So several years now passed that I realized how numerous the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true. So as a result of it, he explained in this course, I say I have many false opinions. Now, I cannot go through all my opinions and decide whether they are false or not. I'm only going to see whether they are doubtful, whether they are certain. But I cannot do that with every single opinion either, whether it is doubtful or not. Therefore, he says at the bottom of that page, nor therefore need I survey each opinion individually, a task that would be endless. Rather, because undermining the foundations will cause whatever has been built upon them to crumble of its own accord, I will attack straight away those principles which supported everything I once believed. What is the first foundation that provides all my beliefs? My senses, my perception, things that come to me through my five senses. Surely, whatever I admitted until now as most true, I received either from the senses or through the senses. However, I have noticed that the senses are sometimes deceptive, and it is a mark of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once. Now, this is an extremely important turn in the history of philosophy, that for him, scientific knowledge, scientific activity cannot be based on the senses. We touched upon that a little bit last time, but I want to emphasize that more. We are under the impression that, as opposed to other activities, science simply observes nature. We have this naive understanding of scientific activity, thinking like, oh, science looks at the world as opposed to other fields that don't. Science is empirical and collects data, therefore it's true, and other activities do not. That's a very naive and slightly very misleading understanding of science, because scientific activity never really proceeds according to mere observation. What distinguishes modern science that dominates our lives today, if anything, more than anything else, it is the domination of mathematical proposition. It's the calculability, it is the precision, it is the not sort of looking into your experience. Because every scientific truth, but okay, that might be a little bit hyperbolic, but let me try. Most scientific truths actually contradict, if not contradict, at least contest our perception of the world. And that's not unimportant, because the world, according to the object of science, is not at all the way we observe it. We really need to understand that, because people try to make science a common sense. People try to say, well, of course you have to do that. Science tells us that. It's common sense. No, it's not common sense. It's much more complicated than common sense. Common sense doesn't tell me anything about, like, my common sense, if you understand sense as perception, among other things, but let's say sense, like, I don't perceive, I've never seen a single individual coronavirus. I've never looked at it. It's really not my experience at all to see it. I trust science in a different way, not from my common sense, but from a discourse that I really don't quite understand, honestly. They tell me that are invisible things. invisible through my eyes. Yes, it is an observation. You can still see them. You can still see them with the aid of certain, you know, technological devices. Sure, I mean, go to a lab and you can see it, etc. But it's not common sense in the sense that science comes from perception. Here, Descartes is contesting that most of our perception give us misleading and deceptive information. And even if it doesn't all the time, we should not trust them because they do not provide something clear and distinct and indubitable. It is always doubtful. And it's doubtful in the sense that it is not going to be reliable, and it always has the possibility of change. Now, again, this is important, and like I want to emphasize that because most of our discussion that we take somebody's experience as a sufficient ground for truth. We start sentences saying like, I observed this in my life, therefore that gives some kind of legitimacy to my discourse. While this might be a good thing among human empathy and understanding for each other, it is absolutely problematic in order to ascertain the truth of the statements that they make. So we really need to be careful not to confuse human empathy with scientific truth. I know you had that experience. I know you are interpreting your experience like that. I empathize with that. That doesn't make it true. It might make it true for you in terms of a subjective experience that you might have a particular emotional attachment to it, and I empathize with that. But that doesn't mean I should accept that as the general truth for everybody. You cannot conclude from your limited experience a statement that you should expect other people to accept. And that's a very delicate issue because most of our political statements, most of our coalitions and solidarity with each other is really dependent upon affirming our experience. And we should. But that doesn't mean I accept that as the universal truth. And I might not be able to build policies on those experiences. We might not be able to make general overarching laws on the basis of experience. Now, in the past we did that. Most of our laws are actually based on the experience of a particular group of people in society. That's why we call our society to be particularly prejudiced for certain people and against certain people, which is absolutely true. And that's exactly the same problem because they made the laws on the basis of their own experience. They designated certain areas to be dangerous. They designated certain areas to be more expensive, less expensive, more valuable, less valuable. They make certain crimes more punishable, less punishable on the basis of their experience. That is wrong. But that doesn't mean that we should replace those experiences with the experience of other people. It's just that we should stop relying on experience as the fundamental foundation for truth. So as we are discussing a scientific method in terms of experience, in terms of the senses, in terms of perception, we really need to be careful how to imagine and interpret that in our lives, because it seems to be unrelated to many other discussions that we are having in society today, but it's really not so. It's very much connected to base knowledge on human experience. Again, as a result, someone can come to the House of the Parliament or House of Representatives and say, I am cold today. There is no global warming. I live in, I don't know, like I live in Richmond, Indiana in December. It's like minus 21 or minus blah, blah. There's no global warming. That's my experience. It's like, and that experience is real. You should, like, I was really cold, but that experience has no relevance and cannot make a universal claim about whether something like global warming or climate change is true or not. So again, when we agree with the result of the experience, we accept it. But there are many places in which, since we do not agree with the result of the experience, we would reject the very same principle. So I can say, oh, it's based on my experience, or his or experience, her experience, their experience, therefore it should be true. But we also, in the same breath, says, oh, that's just based on your experience, therefore it's false. So we need to be consistent in understanding the philosophical problem underlying it. Is like, people do not have the same experience. That doesn't make them true or false. They are just experiences. You can make policies on the basis of these experiences and those experiences, and we should try to be egalitarian as much as possible in that. But we cannot come with universal overarching truths on the basis of those experiences. That's really what we are criticizing when we are criticizing racism, sexism, ableism of a society. Because that experience should not be universalized, because it doesn't include everybody. So Descartes says, I'm not going to trust anything that comes from my senses. But then he says, but, and that but on page 60, but perhaps, that paragraph starting but perhaps is the second voice. Is the voice that says, yeah, but perhaps, even though the senses do sometimes deceive us when it's a question of very small and distant things, still that there are many other matters concerning which one simply cannot doubt, even though they are derived from the very same senses. For example, that I'm sitting here next to the fire, wearing my winter dressing gown, and that I'm holding this sheet of paper in my hands and the like. So this fire, this hand, this paper. But on what grounds could one deny that these hands and this entire body are mine? Unless I were likened to myself to the insane, like they are the ones who doubt the most, whose brains are impaired by such an unrelenting vapor of black bile. They believe that that was the reason of the insane black bile. And that steadfastly insist that they are kings when they are utter paupers, and they are arrayed in purple robes when they are naked, or that they have heads made of clay, or that are gourds and they made of glass. But such people are mad, and I would appear no less mad where I take their behavior an example for myself. So there's something crazy about doubting everything that comes from the senses. You cannot doubt it. How can you doubt that you are, well, actually, you can doubt it very well. Like, is there a way to tell, like, whether I'm here in front of you? I mean, this makes it particularly difficult because it's a computer, but is there a way to tell, like, I am not just playing a pre-recorded speech?
I think there is a possibility that you can do a recorded speech before that. Guessing like you can. Well, I say it's doable, but it's quite hard because there will be like students will notice when they ask question and they say either like you don't answer their question, keep on the lecture, or you answer to a different type of question that the student is asking. So, I mean, it's doable if you know like the pattern of the student behavior. Like, this is the type of question that he or she will ask you, so you can prepare before that. And yeah, I think that's it.
I knew you were going to say this.
We could also
Therefore, I prepared my response accordingly. Yes, go ahead, Jenny.
you could also just go to your office and check if you're there. like talking to us.
Well, I'm not in my office.
Oh, never mind. Go to wherever you are and be like, are you actually video calling?
I'm actually in Cincinnati right now, so you cannot really check on that. So that's one particular empirical difficulty, but like, since you don't ask many questions, maybe you are under this constant suspicion that I'm not real. So you should really test me whether I'm actually here by asking outrageous questions that I could not have anticipated. But anyway, so this is the kind of problem that Descartes is saying, okay, so I have this pen, it's in front of me, I'm holding it in my hand. How can I possibly doubt that? Now, since the criterion is clear and distinct, this certainty is not a clear rational certainty. This is still an empirical certainty. So it is very difficult to explain this kind of different levels of certainty for Descartes. And then he says like, oh, I may be dreaming, and in dreams, I have the same emotional certainty that I have with respect to holding this pen in my hand. That certainty is a subjective, phenomenological, like emotional, they are not the same thing, but like emotional certainty. I feel certain. But just because I feel certain doesn't mean that it is certain. Therefore, he says, with the other voice now, the first voice who wants to doubt without really being mad, this would be all good, well and good, were I not a man who is accustomed to sleeping at night and to experiencing in my dreams the very same things, and now and then even less plausible ones, as these insane people do when they are awake. So like if you kind of articulate your dream, like, did you have a dream last night? I had a dream. It was like pretty crazy. Like I would even be embarrassed to tell it. But like you explain it with the sort of distance, and then I say, this happened, I know it wasn't true, but at the moment, I felt the exact same certainty that I feel that I'm holding this pen, because I woke up anxious, afraid. I didn't have any emotional distinction. I was totally engaged as if that was the truth. I was genuinely scared. I was like usually I get sad. Like I was genuinely sad because of what I dreamt about. And when I woke up and I said, oh, okay, I'm not sad anymore. It was just a dream. But how is that different from any other sadness? Like you become sad about something and then it goes away. It doesn't remain as sadness. Even the things that were sort of devastating initially might appear to be quite manageable after a while. So that certainty is not what he's looking for. That certainty is not enough. So how often does my evening slumber persuade me of such ordinary things as these, that I'm here, clothed in my dressing gown, seated next to the fireplace, when in fact I'm lying undressed in bed? I mean, his dreams are not very interesting. He is dreaming himself doing what he did during the day, just sitting there by the fire. This head, which I am shaking, is not heavy with sleep. I extend this hand so consciously and deliberately, and I feel it. Such things would not be so distinct for someone who is asleep. So in terms of our consciousness, we really are not ever sure whether what we are experiencing is real. Now, you might individually or subjectively be sure, and you can say, no, I'm here, I know it, I'm for certain, etc. But the point is that subjective certainty is not enough to build a scientific edifice on. So we can never really have scientific knowledge on the basis of the individual experience of people. It has to be certain for everybody. And what is certain for everybody? Now, the content of experience. I can, see blue things, the senses, they are still in the domain of the senses. But there are still certain things that are simple and true whether we are dreaming or not. these are like mathematical propositions. I never dreamed, and no one ever did, 2 plus 2 is 5. Nobody dreamed a triangle with 4 sides. Nobody dreamed that 1 was equal to 2. These are very basic mathematical propositions that are certain regardless of your experience, regardless of your dreams or being awake, etc. So that's important. Now, he takes that one step further. He wants to even doubt mathematical propositions. For that, he says, what if I was under constant and total deception? Now, a very powerful being, let's not call it God, but call it, as he says on page 62, very at the bottom, an evil genius is deceiving me constantly. So again, this is an experiment. He doesn't believe in evil genius. God is not even important for him. What he is really thinking of is our experience, both in terms of our senses, but our mathematical knowledge is completely off with respect to the world. In fact, 2 plus 2 is not 4, it's 5. I can't imagine how that is possible except with this hyperbolic external deception of someone constantly deceiving me. Now, why does he do that? He does that not to seriously doubt 2 plus 2 is 4, but to find something that even if you are completely mad, even if you are completely deceived, even if you have absolutely no relationship to the world, what you can be sure of that your doubt is so radical that you cannot doubt your own doubt. So when he says, I think, therefore I am, everybody says, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. In fact, Descartes says, I doubt, therefore I am. Because when I doubt, it is kind of this circular logic. I cannot doubt that I doubt while doubting. So in a bizarre way, doubt is self-grounding. It makes itself true. You cannot doubt your own doubting because the content and the form of your activity become the same. Therefore, human knowledge, since Descartes, is really based on this negative notion of doubt, which means I think, therefore that's the foundation of truth. Which is really very interesting because we think of truth as this positive set of knowledge. And science says, these are all the truths, these are all the false. That's how we write science books, like all the things that Einstein said was right. Newton was wrong, but not really too bad because we can still use some of his ideas in calculations, etc. But then this Aristotle was completely wrong, etc. We have this notion of trying to understand in terms of sort of positive explanation of truth. That is not scientific. That is dogmatic. The only thing that is scientific is that doubt that whatever I have here might not be true, therefore I have the obligation to search. So therefore yes, today 97% or 99% or 100% of scientists might believe something to be true. That percentage is irrelevant for a scientist because the basis of your truth is doubt and ability to question rather than to accept it dogmatically as true. But as sort of counterintuitive and as problematic as that sounds, is science is supposed to be negative, supposed to be based on doubt. Scientists should not be dogmatic. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, we can accept science as well as religion or any kind of opinion. No, not at all. We are trying to understand the logic of scientific activity. That doesn't make it any worse or equal to other discourses that claim to be true, which no, actually precisely because it has that doubt, it is superior to other discourses. But it's not a positive body of knowledge, but it is the doubt. So they say, I think, therefore I am. This I can be anyone and everyone. It's a universal I. It's not just Descartes. I thinks. The I thinks. Therefore, you as a person can occupy that position and you can think. That's the foundation of our knowledge for Descartes. Which is very bizarre because it is the most indubitable, but since there are 7.8 possible billion I's, it's also very unstable in our minds because then we think like, oh, everybody has an individual opinion for themselves, etc. No, not at all. This is just one. The activity of thinking. That is the same for everybody. Now, sometimes you might think like other people are not thinking enough or they are not thoughtful enough. I think that a lot. But that just means that they are not coming to the same conclusions that I do. But that doesn't mean they are not thinking. Not according to Descartes. They are certainly thinking. Maybe they shouldn't, but they I mean, politically, I think that, but theoretically, that's impossible. Okay, I know you have to go to whatever. Is anybody going to the test? Okay. I'll stop unless there are questions. So I started putting these, there was something wrong with I can stop this. Okay, so class ends here today.